So this is Dr. Richard Benjamins, Chief AI Data Strategist from Telefonica. What a privilege, Richard, to have you join us tonight. He is rated, I'm going to embarrass you here, Richard, sorry, but he's rated amongst the 100 most influential people in data-driven businesses. He's a co-author and vice president of the Spanish Observatory for Ethical and Social Impacts of AI. He was Group Chief Data Officer for AXA, and before that worked 10 years at Telefonica on big data analytics. He's the founder of Telefonica's Big Data for Social Good department, a member of the B2G Data Sharing expert group of the EC, frequent speaker at AI events, and has a PhD in cognitive science, published over 100 scientific articles. So hopefully we think we're in very good company with Richard tonight. Thank you for coming to talk to us. The time is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Richard. Can you see my screen? Yeah, okay. So I'm going to tell you a bit about what we did in the community and in Telefonica of using AI and big data for social good, in this specific case for fighting COVID, the COVID crisis. I will give you a brief overview of what we talk about. First, I'm going to explain you what kind of data is used to work with this kind of projects. Secondly, I give you many examples of what actually has been done in reality for COVID. And then this is all work done with governments. So I want to highlight a little bit on how that is. Yeah? And as you will see later, it's not so simple to work with the different types of governments if you want to solve a crisis on the spot. And finally, what should we do? What are the challenges and how can we move forward to improve better on the next pandemics? So let's first look at something about big data. Yeah? Anonymized and aggregated big data can be seen as a proxy for human activity. Yeah? It's a bit like Plato's cave, where the people, in the cave saw some kind of shadows, and they interpret many things from those shadows, even though they didn't see the reality. But actually the shadows were a proxy of reality. And that's the case with big data as well. Yeah? Here's some examples. If you look at, for instance, payment data coming from financial institutions, if you anonymize, you aggregate that, you can get fairly good estimations of the consumer price index, poverty rates, and even the economic impact of natural disasters. Yeah? We've seen it also today with COVID. Many economies are in danger, and during the confinement, this is perfectly reflected in the data that the financial service institution has. You probably all remember the work with that search engines like Google did with the influenza breakouts. People who have symptoms start to look at, and if you follow where those search queries are made, you actually can get an idea how this propagates. Yeah? Later on, there were found some problems with this approach, but anyway, yeah. So it's an important proxy, and I said it's a proxy. Yeah, it's not perfect. It can be wrong. Satellite imaging can be used to measure the increment of GDPs rather than looking at statistical offices. And that's of today, mobile phone data can be used, for instance, to estimate literacy maps and also socioeconomic levels by simply looking at how people top up or pay their bills. Yeah. Let's look at those proxies in one country, Spain. This is Telefonica's mobile network. It's about 150,000 antennas, 1 billion events a day, over 20 million customers, and almost 1 million roamers a day. Of course, this is pre-confinement. It will look very different now in terms of travelers. And so this is anonymized and aggregated, a proxy of, as we will see, mobility. Yeah? We all know that COVID is a contagious disease, and therefore the factor of people moving around is very important. This has been recognized, even though a bit late, by many governments. So the European Commission started end of March to ask the operators in Europe to share some anonymized and aggregated data to fight COVID. It was end of March. The crisis started at the beginning of March, so it took them a month to act on that. And only recently, a few weeks ago, or actually maybe last week, they published the first results in 3 reports and a press release about their analysis of Europe. Yeah, if you're interested, it's really interesting to read. We will see some examples here, but not only those, not only the Commission, also basically every European company, many African countries, many South American companies, Asian companies worked on this to use this kind of telco data, anonymized and aggregated, to understand better the development of the crisis. Yeah. Now let's see a few examples. Yeah. If you look at how this data helps, there are basically 4 basic use cases. Yeah. First, mobility patterns are very stable across the country. Yeah. They don't change a lot. So if you understand those mobility patterns and the crisis and the virus enters somewhere in the country, you can basically predict where it will propagate first. Yeah? And that can help you to prepare hospitals or to confine certain areas. Yeah? Of course, if you do this after 1 month when the virus already propagated, then it doesn't have a lot of effect. Yeah? But it's important to do this upfront. Once you have the crisis there, you need to confine. You as a government want to know how this confinement is followed up by population. Yeah? And therefore you can monitor this at the province level, at the region level, even at the city level, and sometimes at the district level, just to understand if things are going well, and if not, then maybe you can take actions. Yeah? The third one is to improve the epidemiological models. Yeah? So those are mathematical models that predict how a virus propagates. And of course, these are viruses that are contagious, that there is a mobility factor in the model. But traditionally, those mobility factors are coming from census data, yeah? Static data, whereas if you are in a crisis, mobility data is very different. So if you put in weekly or even daily data, you can actually refresh the predictions on a frequently basis, and that can help you find out where the crisis will propagate, and that can help to find additional, to supply additional medical healthcare or prepare intensive unit cares, etc. Yeah, and finally, it's about economic recovery, because we all know that it has been very hard for many economies by closing down the whole countries, and it is important to also measure and monitor this recovery of economic activity. Yeah? And as you may understand, mobility data, so how people move around, is very much related to economic activity. Yeah? The more mobility, the more activity there is. Now let's see a few examples across different countries. Yeah? This is the mobility in Spain. What you see at the bottom are the days, and the bars that you see. So the first bar is actually video, are just before the confinement in Spain, where mobility is in the 90s. Then there is some announcement, it goes down, and then there is the confinement, and you see sometimes it goes down all the way to maybe 80 or 90%. Yeah, and you see this at the province level, but you can also see it at city level and at sometimes even at district level. Yeah, so this gives the government an insight, and actually this is publicly available. Yeah? The government an insight as to how confinement measures are fulfilled. You can definitely see the patterns of the weekdays and of the weekend, even public holidays, etc. Yeah? Here's an example of Brazil. In Brazil, the relation was not directly with the government, with this industry organization of telecommunications companies. They came together and they worked together for 2 specific use cases. Again, this was monitoring of isolation of population, and also detection of accumulation of people in strategic places, in terms of for strategic places for fighting the crisis, such as hospitals and test locations. Now, you've all heard the news. You see what the news of Brazil. So it was very hard to do this at the federal government level. So this has happened at the state level. Yeah. So 17 states have joined, and 20 municipalities across the country. Yeah. Argentina. In Argentina, use the same type of data to calculate a mobility index, which there they considered very close to the R index, so how the R index changes with mobility, and also a transit index, that is people moving inside and outside regions, and comparing that with the pre-confinement and the post-confinement. Yeah? Here they delivered dashboards to government, national, and also to regional agencies for specific use cases, like understanding whether the the relaxation of the, let's say, confinement was followed, because it always goes in phases, and you can follow up whether that is correctly happening. Also to forecast contagions after the relaxation of the confinement, and also supporting the economic activity. In Ecuador, this was worked with the National Operations and Emergency Center and the government itself. And here also there was actually a prediction of how COVID will predict in the country, because as you all know, in South America, it happened all later. So there was a bit more time for governments to be prepared for the ones who wanted to do that. This is an example of France, of the work that the European Commission is doing with the telcos in Europe. If you see, so this is a correlation between mobility and cases and infected people, but it uses here a proxy of the number of deaths in excess of past year in certain areas. So they use that as a proxy to say, okay, all the excess of that might be caused by COVID. And then if you look at it, these are heat maps, and there is a very close correspondence between connectivity of certain areas. So what connectivity, the rate of connectivity in terms of travels between certain regions of provinces, and the number of deaths in excess. And they calculated that it's about 90% you can explain, 90% of the cases you can explain by mobility if there is no additional measure like confinement or masks, etc. Here is the last example. This is also an example of Spain, but this is mostly focused on economic activity. What you see here is the map of Spain, with the black lines are the provinces, so administrative levels. But the colors, they group together what is called mobility functional areas. So those are areas that go cross-border. They might be within a province. And the lesson here is that those are natural areas of mobility of people, which probably hints at economic groups, economic activity. So if you need to release, if you need to relax confinement, or you need to reconfine, and if you want to harm the economy as less as possible, it is better to use those functional areas than the administrative areas. Because if you confine, but you don't split a functional area, then you keep economic activity much more than if you just cut it in two and maybe you kill it. So this is a new insight coming from the data that the European Commission wants to translate and explain to the different member states to see whether this is an idea either for now or for the future. Of course, it's harder for a government to explain mobility functional areas than administrative areas. It's very easy to understand for the population. People in this province cannot leave, and in that they can move around. But if it's a kind of vague border from certain areas within a province or a city and others not, then you have to do some explanation. But still, it's an interesting experience. Now, working with governments. If you look at disaster management in general, and this is a figure that we use, people who are working in AI and big data for good all the time. So by disaster, you have four main phases, divided in two before the event and two after the event. If the disaster happens, you have an immediate response. Everything needs to go quick. You need to be in place. You need to understand what's happening, etc. Once you've done that, you need to recover. And then you do mitigation, prevention, so it won't happen again. But then you also need to prepare for a disaster. Now, if you look at the situation of COVID, then almost all governments in the world started at the response. So once the disaster happened, when the pandemic was really called by the World Health Organization, somewhere mid-March, then they started to think about. They could have started already in December with the first notices, but it didn't happen. There were only 2 countries in the world who were prepared and who acted very rapidly. I'm talking only about big data and COVID, not about other things. And those were China and South Korea. We all know why. They have different perspectives on privacy. So they already had the data in place. They had the data already. And they had already access to the data. So they could act much quicker. And sometimes not even with aggregated and anonymized data, but even with the personal level. So out of the question for our society here at the moment. And if you look at the recovery phase we are now in, you've probably all heard about this privacy preserving proximity tracing, decentralized or centralized, that uses Bluetooth in devices that can help you find out whether you've been in touch or close by a person who was positive. I think only in Germany, maybe a few countries, other countries that is in place, many not. We don't know how it works yet, but definitely something about recovery. But it is worrying that governments across the world were too late. I'm from the group Community of AI for Good. We've insisted many times with governments to be prepared, but nobody was really interested. I hope that will change now. Now, if you are a company, you have interesting data for such kinds of things, not only for COVID, but for doing good, the sustainable development goals. There are many ways to work with governments. We've worked with national governments, regional or local governments, European Commission, as you saw. We also work with the National Institute for Health, with National Statistics Institute, with humanitarian organizations, research organizations, and universities, even with industry bodies. So really, it's not really clear how to move forward, how to do it. In the current state of place, it depends more on the people you meet than on the type of government you are talking to. So it's still a kind of mess. This data sharing for COVID is actually an instance of a larger phenomenon called business to government data sharing, and the European Commission has installed an expert group to find out and to help advise on how does this need to happen, because it happens, but it happens only a little, and so it needs to scale and it needs to be sustainable. I was part of that expert group, and I will share with you a few high-level insights. First, the type of data there is. So as you can see, there is raw data, pre-processed data, processed data, and data-driven insights. What we've seen now in this talk is only insights. We've never shared low-level data. It's always the insights, mobility data, origin and destination matrices. At the top, you can see the value chain. It's a typical value rank for data collection and big data, but what's very important is that there needs to be decisions taken with the data. It's of no use if you share data with the government, but then they don't know how to act on it. And that also is still happening. Very quickly, sharing data with governments is a process where you have to take into account many different things. For instance, you have to find out, is it worthwhile? What are the benefits? What are the risks? What are actually the risks of not doing it, not using data, etc. And you have to take all sides of other things in account as well. And then there is the business model. How does it work? Is it pro bono? Do you charge for it, etc.? What we've seen, and this is about the challenges moving forward, is that the main challenges in this work so far has been first a privacy confusion. So many press and many, let's say, public opinion doesn't distinguish well between personal data and anonymized and aggregated data. And the things that I showed you, which is aggregated and anonymized data, are sometimes mixed up with contact tracing, which has nothing to do with it. Then there is an ethical question. People ask themselves, is it ethical from a privacy perspective to use all this kind of data, even if it's anonymized and aggregated? But I always say there is also the other question. Is it ethical not using this kind of data? If you, as a government, you can have it and actually solve the problem quicker and avoid that. Then another challenge is financial sustainability. Everything you've seen here is pro bono. It's because companies feel responsible and want to help. But if this crisis lasts for 3 years, then a few companies will be able to keep it up, because this is all pro bono. But it needs investment, etc. And finally, a challenge that I learned is that if a government uses your data as a company to take decisions, and sometimes are hard decisions, then you as a company and governments need to be transparent on this. Yeah. Then sometimes you as a company may be caught up in a controversial political decisions, and that's the last thing you want. Yeah? So these are the challenges need to be worked on, and actually, luckily, there are several organizations who are working on that, which you can see here on the right. And I wanted just to finish with this. Yeah? So I all know, you all remember the tsunami in 2004 that killed over 300,000 people. Yeah? 10 years later, there was this press notice that said, now we have a tsunami alert system in place. Yeah, it works. If there's a tsunami, everybody who needs to be alerted gets alerted. I'm sure it was not pro bono. It has cost a lot of money, but it's there. I think we need something similar for mobile, big data analytics across the world, every country, one operator, relation with the government. If there is a pandemic, within 24 hours, governments have data to stop the pandemic before it is too late. Thank you very much.
Richard, thank you so much. Very, very interesting. I'm burning with questions, but we'll hold those back. If you can stick around for another 20 minutes, then we can take some Q&A, particularly around your talk. Would that be okay?
Yeah, that's fine.
Wonderful, thank you.